Hello everybody, welcome to my Monday introduction to philosophy and theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. I am so glad that you are joining me today. I am currently back in London, which makes me very happy because London is where I lived for many years when I was working as an academic. In fact, it feels so familiar to be back in London and hosting these sessions that it's almost a little bit like being back at university, which is of course lovely. Today, we're going to be talking about Friedrich Dürrenmatt, Der Besuch der alten Dame, which is a tragic comedy in 3 acts. I'm also going to be using this to talk about the Hegelian dialectic, the notion of speculative idealism versus transcendental idealism, and finally also, of course, we're going to continue talking about the Hegelian Cunning of Reason. If you're new to this live stream lecture series, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're part of our learning community. This is essentially a project that I started almost 3 years ago when I used to work as an academic at the University of Oxford Brookes. And when the pandemic started, I started hosting free open access live lectures that anybody could join. Back then, we were a group of about 10 students, all of whom I knew in person. And in the following years, this has mushroomed into a global community of like-minded philosophy and learning enthusiasts. So if you'd like to learn a little bit about philosophy, feel free to stay a while. Whether you're a complete beginner or a more advanced learner, I try to make these sessions accessible without dumbing them down. In fact, that's always been the goal, to essentially provide you with a 45-minute academic-style, graduate-level lecture so that you can dip your toes in, or you can stay a while and join me for the entire lecture series over the course of 3 months. Now, the reason that I can do this open access and for free is because I have the generous financial backing of a small group of global patrons. And it's really due to those patrons that I can keep hosting these lectures online for free. So a huge thank you to all of our patrons. And if you'd like to download my ebook, The Complete Guide to Zizek, please consider becoming a patron, where you can download the ebook, which contains the first 8 volumes based on the previous 8 lectures, as well as all the accompanying materials for this series. So audio downloads, edited transcripts for every lecture, and it'll also bring you into our community with a host of bonus perks like a Discord and a weekly Q&A session. All that and more you can find on my Patreon by going to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. I already see some comments letting me know where you're joining me from. I see Russia, hello, greetings. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. It makes me incredibly happy to know that people are joining in from around the world. I see London, greetings to you. I see Egypt, Switzerland, Silicon Valley. It makes me so happy. Thank you for letting me know where you're joining me from. And if you're curious about today's session, this is going to be a 45-minute session where we talk about one of my favorite plays, Friedrich Dürrenmatt's Der Besuch der alten Dame, which I believe is one of the best illustrations of the Hegelian concept of the cunning of reason and speculative idealism überhaupt. And we're going to talk about Marxism, we're going to talk about Hegel, about ideology, perhaps a bit of Slavoj Žižek, all that and more in the next 45 minutes. I see you joining in from Switzerland and the Philippines. Hello, Uzbekistan. Hello, Turkey, Merhaba. It's such an incredible privilege to be joined by people from around the world. That means the world to me. And okay, I think we should simply launch right in. Once again, I'm joining you live from London, which brings me great joy because this is where I've lived for many years of my life. And so it's really wonderful to be back. Okay, so let us begin right away. I would like to argue that Friedrich Dürrenmatt's Der Besuch der alten Dame, usually translated as The Visit, is potentially the best illustration of the Hegelian notion of the cunning of reason that I can think of. In fact, that it also serves as a wonderful illustration of what you might call the speculative logic, which is a key component of Hegelian idealism. If you're completely new to Hegel, essentially one of the things that Hegel does is that he juxtaposes transcendental idealism, going back to a Platonic idealism that believes in the idea of a pure form. For Plato, this is of course famously outside of the cave, truth, if you will. He juxtaposes this with a different theory of truth, which he essentially refers to as speculative idealism, and which is a key component of what would then become post-metaphysics, the post-Hegelian term. Now, you don't need to know any of that to enjoy Dürrenmatt's tragic comedy in 3 acts, The Visit. The plot essentially boils down to this. One day, a wealthy heiress, a billionaire, arrives back in her hometown. And in her hometown, she announces that she has made a grant, a $1 billion, I guess dollar in this case, we could say grant to revitalize the town. However, upon one condition. Her condition is that the man who used to be in her husband and who's now a very popular resident in said town, the owner of a general store, that this man be killed. That is her one condition, that she will give the town $1 billion and rescue the town from financial obscurity and ruin if they agree to kill her former husband. Now, I'll say right away that the townspeople respond very clearly. Their response is, of course, oh my gosh, oh, sorry. I dropped everything. Sorry, this is very precarious. Are we still here? Okay, well, I hope we're still here. Apologies for that. This is very improvised, a highly improvised recording studio. I just have it propped up on some DVDs. Okay, so the townspeople, I hope you're still here, the townspeople respond by saying, of course we're not going to kill the most popular man in town. Who do you think we are, that we would be so easily swayed by this financial offer, essentially a bribe? We are a town of law and order, of ethics and morality. Excuse me, I'm laughing because I'm seeing the comments. Yes, I hope you're still with us after the camera fell. Essentially, the townspeople respond with indignity, essentially to say, how could you come to this town of law and order, offer us money, and think that we would simply kill this person simply for money? Who do you think we are? And at this point, the lady who was offered the $1 billion says, okay, I can wait. And she takes up residence in a hotel. And what's so interesting at this point is that the townspeople, even though they've decided not to kill the man and therefore not to receive the money, the townspeople start to act as if they were about to receive a large grant. In fact, the billionaire heiress had specified that the $1 billion were to be split. Half would go to the town and half would go as a grant, kind of universal income to the people. And what happens in the town is that the man, who has not yet been killed, who works at the general store, realizes that people come and they start buying things as if they were anticipating his death, which of course makes no sense. After all, they had said that they weren't going to kill him. Now, what happens eventually, I will give you spoilers for Dürrenmatt's The Visit, is that the town essentially comes together and in a unanimous vote decides that this man has committed many grievous crimes to the community, and that this man, who was once the most popular man, now is the man who has to be condemned to death. In other words, in a sense, they have done exactly as the lady asked. However, the key thing here is that instead of making an exception to the rule of law, instead of saying we have the rule of law and we're going to kill this man, but we're going to turn a blind eye to the law, instead it's that the rule of law itself has to be changed so that in a unanimous democratic vote, the townspeople vote for the man to be killed and for his body to be delivered to the woman. And yet, there's one thing that's even more important here. This is the most beautiful, ironic twist at the end of the play. At the end of the play, after the man has been killed, after essentially the townspeople have unanimously voted that they have to have him killed in order to uphold the rule of law. Remember, originally his death was supposed to be antithetical to the rule of law. Now that the man is being killed, journalists come in and they write a story about what occurred. And their story is that the man was in fact not killed, but that the man had a heart attack and that he died. And what was the cause of the heart attack? Well, the cause of the heart attack was his joy, knowing that his death would revitalize the town. And here we have a beautifully paradoxical, if you will, dialectical illustration of the Hegelian idea of the cunning of reason. Namely, how the cause becomes its own effect. Think about it for a moment, right? The man had to be killed in order for the town to be revitalized. And yet, He's supposed to have died or succumbed from a heart attack incurred by the joy at the very thing that would only happen if he were to die. And here we have the most beautiful illustration of Hegelian speculative idealism, which is that there is no truth beyond or underneath the man's death. In a sense, he is overjoyed to have died and to have enriched the town, and yet without his death, this joy wouldn't have occurred in the first place. It's almost a little bit similar to the Marxist idea that it's only within capitalism that workers have to be grateful that they are exploited, that they are grateful to have received the opportunities to be crushed onto the ground, as it were. Now, the reason that this is such an interesting example for me, apart from being slightly ironic, of course, hence the tragic-comic element of this play, is that one of the key instances of the Hegelian cunning of reason, Hegel's theory of history and dialectics, is therefore that that history doesn't move forward in a linear development. It's not moving towards one preconceived path. Instead, history is constantly being rewritten. In fact, the very knowledge and understanding of the passage of time is itself concurrent to the idea of the passage of time. And what's beautiful is that as soon as the lady shows up and offers $1 billion to the townspeople, in a sense, the event has already occurred, and now it's revealing itself in its own notion, to put it in Hegelese. Remember, last week in the lecture I said that the famous theater idea in theater of Chekhov's gun, namely that when the gun is put on the table, eventually in the third act, it has to go off, it has to be fired. That strictly speaking, the firing of the gun already occurs in the moment of its appearance. It's not that it culminates in the logical outcome of it having to be fired. This would be a kind of empty historical determinism, but that instead the very presence of the gun is already the shot in its own becoming. And this is what the lady does when she arrives in the visit. Her idea that her offer of $1 billion sets in motion the very concurrent structural mechanisms by which the town eventually will accept those $1 billion, except not by making an exception to the rule, but instead by changing the rule from within. In other words, it's no longer that they're killing the popular man in order to appease the woman and therefore to be essentially bribed. It's that the very constellation has itself changed, by which now the townspeople see it as their ethical duty to deliver the man to the woman. In other words, this is now the highest form of their own necessity. What's interesting here, of course, and again, to go back, is the ideological component comes after the fact, which is that the crime, as it were, which is now being universalized or legitimized as law, the unanimous vote to kill the man, has to be nevertheless supplemented, if you will, by the story that the journalists write that the man was in fact not killed, but that he died of joy. He died of joy in anticipation of his very death, if you will. And this overlap, this dialectical concurrence, is the speculative moment for Hegel. And here we can go once again back to the transition from transcendental idealism to speculative idealism. The transcendental notion is that there is some pure truth or pure form that lies underneath appearances. The Hegelian insight in speculative idealism is that the illusion, the appearance, the thing which appears to be antithetical to truth, itself contains the truth. In a sense, to simplify here, that there is more truth in the lie, as it were. That the appearance by which the townspeople killed the man was therefore not a cover-up. It wasn't that the man was secretly, illicitly killed and that the townspeople are trying to pretend that this was something that happened legitimately. It's that the very nature of the town itself had to change in order to retroactively justify the death of the man, the killing of the man. And that, in a sense, the man's own agency, his subjective stance apropos the necessity of his death, therefore changes as well. He is popular, and therefore he can be killed because his death will revitalize the town. And so the entire sequence closes in upon itself. Here we actually have something that's very similar to Marx's theory of evolution. Strictly speaking, Marx inverts his stance on evolution. It's almost a quip, if you will, which is that Marx's quip apropos evolution, which appears to be an anti-evolutionary stance but is not, is that Marx essentially jokes that the monkey does not contain the truth of man. This would be the evolutionary premise, right? Monkey contains the pre-evolutionary truth of man. Marx instead quips that it's the other way around, that man contains the truth of monkey. In other words, and he takes this almost verbatim from Hegel, essentially man is the unfolding of monkey in its own notion. That instead of seeing in monkey the kind of prefiguration of that which is necessary in man, it's only from the perspective of modern subjectivity and empirical rationalism that we can deduct and conclude the true nature of evolution, if you will. In other words, evolution is something that can appear only in the particular constellation which is modern man and subjectivity, and that therefore it is not so much that monkey contains the truth of man, but that man contains the truth of monkey. The unfolding of a higher necessity that in a sense begins with monkey, but is blind to its own realization or its own becoming. It's also why the Marxist position is always to say that instead of trying to dig underneath and find some truth that lies underneath the world of appearances, which of course for Marx are the structural mechanisms of economic production, that it is within this very facade, within the very veil of contemporary phenomena, and of course what would then come to be called ideology, that we have to find and seek the truth. This is something that Marx could only think against the backdrop of the Hegelian idea of speculative idealism, namely that the truth lies within the appearance because the appearance is the unfolding of the notion that lay within the original concept. Marx actually has another way to look at this, which might be easier because I realize that this is abstract, is to think about Marx's well-known theory of money versus the commodity. Strictly speaking, in a pre-capitalist society, money would serve to mediate or facilitate the exchange between commodities, right? You have two commodities that are being exchanged, and money facilitates this exchange. I will sell you I'll sell you a banana for a pencil, and money makes this possible because, of course, there's nothing similar about a banana and a pencil. Therefore, the transition that occurs within capitalism is that money is no longer the facilitator of an exchange between two non-correlative objects. Instead, it inverts itself. So it's no longer object, money, object, or if you will, commodity, money, commodity, by which the money facilitates the exchange of commodities. Instead, within capitalism, it's inverted. It becomes money, commodity, money. In other words, the very material thing, let's say Apple now, serves to facilitate the generation of more surplus value, more surplus profit. And think about the difference here, right? Instead of having two objects of which the trade is facilitated by having an abstract entity, namely money, it's that two abstract entities, money, are facilitated by the existence of a material object. This is the central premise. This is what is absolutely key about materialism and the transition from speculative idealism towards dialectical materialism. Marx essentially takes the Hegelian notion, which is that the truth doesn't lie in the objective conditions of the town's ethics or whatever, as in The Visit, but instead in the very facade and the very illusion by which the town thinks of itself. Which I know I'm not explaining this very well. Marx essentially makes the same argument apropos materiality, that the speculative identity of the material thing changes in relation to its own negation. And think about it, to go back to the example, if we have two objects which we are trading, a banana for a pencil, then it's not just a barter economy, it requires money in order to facilitate the exchange. In other words, to create the notion of value that can be comparative between a banana and a pencil. As soon as money itself, or if you will, value itself, becomes the thing which has to be exchanged, therefore the object becomes that which is idealistically constitutive of the increase of value of those things. This is Marx's famous idea of all that is solid melts into air. The solid object, the commodity, is therefore no longer being exchanged. It's that the solid object remains in place so that the money, this financial speculative value, can increase. Like if you go, for example, to a country like Turkey, if you go to the outskirts of Istanbul, you'll see these enormous apartments that are completely empty, most of them, because they're entirely being built for speculative purposes. In other words, the material object, excuse me, the material object, the apartments exists simply to further facilitate speculative value, speculative money. And, excuse me, losing my voice a little bit. And the point here about materialism, I think this is very, I may actually need some water, but I don't know if I have any water. Water, no, I don't have any. Okay, I'm gonna get water very quickly. No, I'm good, I'm good. Okay, I'm back. The point here is that the key instance of dialectical materialism isn't that Marx simply posits that Hegel's metaphysical absolute idealism has to be supplemented with a more material, grounded, political economic theory. Instead, it's that the very principle of speculative idealism finds its notion within the material form. Namely, that the material thing becomes, if you will, a speculative supplement around which the financial accumulation of surplus value in goods is facilitated. And essentially what this means is very simple. What this means is that in the differentiation or the evolution from money as a facilitator of exchange between commodities, we have now an eternalization of economic production. And Marx's argument, in other words, Marx's famous argument about the commodity form, namely how its objects become considered as people and people become considered as objects, etc., has nothing to do with the fact that we treat people poorly or we treat people as mere automata, as, you know, the mechanical reproducers of surplus value. It's specifically that the nature of the world, the nature of subjectivity, in other words, of what it means to be alive, itself becomes subject to the furthering of the structural mechanisms that generate this speculative value. Now, let's go back to the example that I had before, those empty apartment blocks in Turkey. The empty apartment blocks, strictly speaking, are real. They're materially there. They exist. And yet, in a strictly speaking kind of sense, they don't facilitate human life. They're not being used for people to live in. They're simply the empty, if you will, shells or relics that allow for the speculative mechanism, the movement of financial exchange. And here we have, in a sense, the speculative component from speculative idealism reiterated in the form of dialectical materialism, which is that it's no longer that we have a pure form or a truth that lies beyond the veil of illusion. It's that the truth of the commodity never lies in the commodity as such. You could go to this empty apartment block, knock on the door, and see that nobody lives there, but it wouldn't tell you anything about the real conditions of life as such. Instead, it's what lies behind that. It's that the empty apartment block facilitates the speculative value that is necessitated for economic development within Turkey. In other words, it's a surplus, it's excessive. The material thing has to be there so that life can be sustained and become increasingly financially speculative, as it were. This is also, and once again, we lost the camera. Apologies. YouTube, that must be very disorienting. I apologize to people watching here. Now, this transition, whereby money is no longer simply the facilitator of the exchange of commodities, but instead the commodity becomes the empty speculative vessel that allows for the sustained circulation of money, therefore posits an infinite dimension. Namely, strictly speaking, this can keep going on and on and on. It's the virtualization of value and of financial exchange. It's also how increasingly money and the financial mechanisms and institutions that sustain the banks become detached from what people know and experience in their own lives. And that nevertheless, it appears to you as if what happens in the banks is therefore necessary and nevertheless foundational to the continuation of life as we know it. It's like Frederick Jameson's famous quip that it has become easier to imagine the end of the world than it has become to imagine the end of capitalism. And this isn't just a cynical joke. In a strictly speaking, a philosophical sense, it is true that the very lens through which we understand reality, through which we access possibility in the world, is created by the structural incentive structures that we know through capitalism. In other words, it's like the lady who arrives in Dürrenmatt's play, The Visit, in the town, who makes the offer of $1 billion and therefore sets in motion the purely speculative energies of the people in the town, which then retroactively has to be ratified through the ethical rule of law by which the villagers vote unanimously to kill the man, not to appease the woman, but to prove that they are a good town. In fact, this is essentially the relationship between ideology and capitalist production. Remember, at the end of The Visit, the journalists write a story in which the man dies of joy, knowing that his death will revitalize the town. Here we have the Hegelian overlap of cause and effect. Cause becomes its own effect. And that's essentially what happens within capitalism. It's not just that the worker should be grateful that he is being exploited. It's that his very exploitation is framed as the precondition for his own self-realization. In other words, how he is supposed to be a happy, thriving, successful subject citizen. Therefore, the very idea of what it means to be a subject today is therefore overdetermined in advance by the necessary participation that reproduces the structural mechanisms of the capitalist system of exploitation. Now we can go back to the idea, banana, which is mediated through the exchange of money, for pencil, to inert, empty object, which facilitates the reproduction of financial speculative value, and we can realize that it's not just the object that does this. It's the subject who does this. In other words, man becomes the subject object, the material, empty, dead thing that in its very inactivity, or of course the activity of relentless production, which is a kind of pseudo-activity within capitalism, sustains the speculative growth and value of financial growth. And that, of course, is what Marx famously refers to as alienation. It's that man, subject, becomes the empty material vessel who sees his own realization as being that which concurs or supplements or overlaps the self-reproduction of capital and financial speculation. In other words, surplus value for those who invest within the continued production of the subject. Therefore, the reproduction of subjectivity is in its own effect, the reproduction of the economic incentive structure of capitalism. And what's so important here is that this, for Hegel, isn't some elaborate, Hegel writes, of course, pre-capitalism, but from the perspective of speculative reason, this is not some elaborate trick underneath which lies true or authentic subjectivity. This is something that Marx actually relates to bourgeois ideology. Marx says that one of the ultimate aspects of bourgeois ideology is precisely the insistence on authentic goods, something which is handmade. Like you go into a store today and you'll see that the most middle-class expensive objects are always those which come with a little story. This is pure ideology, even if it's true, precisely if it's true. This milk was crafted by a small family-owned business in the heart of, Oxfordshire or something like this. This story that we are told about the authenticity of the commodity, which is supposed to set it apart from the mass-reproduced other commodities. Of course, today, authenticity being itself the most mass-reproduced commodity. This is how ideology functions. And again, not because it's false, not because it's not true. The truth lies precisely within the ideological component, which is that the authenticity of the project is sold to you as a form of surplus enjoyment, to put it in psychoanalytic terms, that makes you want it even more. There's a great line about this that I think is really important, about propaganda. Propaganda is propaganda, even if it is true, right? We think about propaganda as being something that is a lie, something that is told to you so that you don't see the truth. Like, for example, if I say this apple is in fact a banana, propaganda. We are misleading you. And yet, the same can be said for when propaganda is true. If I tell you that this apple is beautiful and an example of British identity, and that when you eat it, you partake in the beautiful sunshine of the British country, etc., all of these things are true, and yet they nevertheless remain propaganda. The same is true for ideology. Ideology isn't simply hoodwinking you. Ideology is ideology even if it's true. And so if something is sold to you as being authentic and from the land and goes back to a hand-sourced agricultural communal farm or whatever, even if it's true, even if it's a good thing, it's nevertheless ideological. It's nevertheless sustaining the narrative that is necessitated to further economic reproduction, which therefore becomes the economic reproduction by which capitalism reproduces itself. And the way in which you participate in that is, of course, that you are an educated, ethical consumer who identifies by means of what you buy. Think about it. Within contemporary modern life, what we are taught above all, the information that we receive most readily, is how to consume, what to consume, and what our consumption says about us and signals about us to other people. All the minute differences between whether you are someone who uses a Mac or a PC, or if you drive a BMW or ride a bicycle, that the way in which we identify becomes correlative to how we consume. That therefore, the way in which we spend our money says something about who we think we are in the world, who we would like to be, what we signal to others, but more crucially, who we think we are to ourselves. And again, this doesn't have to be bad. This doesn't mean that you should stop buying things or that you should walk around in, a wheat sack or something. There's no truth underneath this. The point, the rupture that occurs with the notion of speculative idealism is that the truth doesn't lie beyond. The truth lies within this very illusion, this very appearance. And this is great. I'll give you an example of this going all the way back to Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius has this wonderful, and yet to my mind, deeply deceptive idea where he says, one of the things you should practice is that you should look around you and you should always remind yourself that it is an illusion, that it means nothing, that underneath there is something that cannot be grasped. For example, Marcus Aurelius says, if you look at a piece of meat, you should always remind yourself that it comes from an animal, that what you're putting into your mouth is in fact a dead thing. Or that Marcus Aurelius is surprisingly crass here. He says that what appears to you as metaphysical bliss and orgasm, sexual practice, is in fact simply a mechanical, biological response by which you excrete a fluid after you've rubbed up against somebody else, right? This is not materialism. Materialism is never the insistence on the brute, hard core of authentic reality. Instead, the central premise of materialism, which would therefore only be possible because of Hegel's speculative idealist turn, is to say that the truth lies not beyond the illusion, the truth lies in the illusion as such. Think about it. The materialist notion isn't to say that the truth of sexual intercourse is that it is simply two hard bodies rubbing up against each other until your brains connect in a certain way that you achieve orgasm. Sorry to be crude. Instead, the materialist notion is precisely that which emphasizes the almost spiritual, quasi-metaphysical dimension that occurs in this moment of absolute self-negation. The French know this perfectly well. I've said this before, that an orgasm is referred to as the petit mort, or a little death, this moment of absence, this moment of bliss in which you are no longer there, in which you lose yourself in the other. And think about it, the church was always, traditionally the church was scared of carnal pleasure, not because it was a material thing that distracted you from the idea of God, but precisely because of the realization that there is a metaphysical dimension within this empty space, within this negation, this bliss of absolute self-negation, this lost in the other, in your own pleasure, the hedonistic element of that. And so we're back at the idea of the logic of speculative reason, which Marx finds in the logic of what would later in Engels become dialectical materialism, which is to say, in the same way that money used to facilitate the exchange between commodities, now the commodity becomes this empty, nevertheless material vessel which facilitates the eternal circular exchange of financial speculative value. In other words, the material element here is precisely that which is drained of its material truth. If you looked at the object that facilitates the value, there is nothing in the object that tells you about its truth. It's just an empty object. Instead, the truth lies within the structural mechanism by which the object sustains monetary and financial speculative activity. In other words, here we come to the traditional technical definition of the critique of ideology. The critique of ideology isn't you have to see through the fantasy. When you look at a piece of meat, in fact, what you're seeing is an animal. When you have sex, it is in fact that two bodies are rubbing up against each other and that your endorphins are being released, etc. It's exactly the other way around. You never look at the underlying organic truth. Instead, you look at the truth that lies within the illusion. A more technical way of saying that is that you look at the content that lies within the form. This is the traditional technical term for Ideologie critique, the critique of ideology. What is the content that is hidden in the form? In other words, not what is the content in the object. Remember the example of going to an empty apartment block in Turkey and just finding that there's no one there. What is the secret within the form that is sustained by this empty object? And of course, the form for Marx is the form of economic capitalist production and exchange. Therefore, the truth of the system, if you will, lies not in the object or beyond the object. In other words, it's no longer transcendental in nature. Instead, the truth lies within the structural mechanisms, within the form itself. And now, if you make a massive leap from Marx's idea of the commodity and the speculative value of the commodity back to a metaphysical argument, you can see how Marx can only make this argument apropos Hegel. After all, the Platonic metaphysical model was the allegory of the cave. We have truth outside the cave, pure form, eternity, essence. And then we have the world of appearances in the cave, impure form, namely forms that appear to you, phenomena. Hegel argues that the truth lies within this debased form, that the truth lies within the phenomena, and yet not in the phenomena themselves, but in their becoming, which is avant la lettre, Hegel arguing what Marx would argue, that the truth lies within the structure. In other words, he's not placing, in an almost Kantian fashion, emphasis on the objects in themselves. There's nothing there. Instead, it's the emphasis that the truth lies only in the relationship, which for Hegel and Kant remains an impossible one, in the relationship between the pure form and the impure form. The truth lies within the structural relationship. And so Hegel's speculative idealism doesn't simply say the truth isn't outside the cave, nor is it saying the truth lies inside the cave, but the very structural mechanism of this dialectical movement is itself the truth in its own becoming. I know, again, highly abstract, and if you're interested in this, we have covered this in other lectures before. And so the transition from speculative idealism that happens from Hegel finds, if you will, its becoming, its notion, within the notion of dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism upholds the speculative idealist principle, except it now applies it to economic form. If you want to take Marx's quip that it's not that the monkey contains the truth of man, but that the man contains the truth of the monkey, you could say, therefore, that it's not that Hegel contains the truth of Marx, it's that Marx contains the truth of Hegel. Marx saves Hegel not only from his misinterpretations, or the misinterpretations of what Hegel is, Marx saves Hegel from the metaphysical, mystical, if you will, absolute dimension. This is one of the key things that I think people don't always realize about Hegel, is that the way he's taught is as this mysticist thinker of the absolute. That Hegel's speculative idealism is absolute idealism, by which there's a preordained path that man is simply following blindly. In fact, if you go to Stanford's definition of the cunning of reason, you will find exactly this totally non-Hegelian definition for Hegel. The Oxford Encyclopedia of Philosophy does the same thing, whereby this The cunning of reason is how a kind of predetermined absolute ideal form of history uses man's passions against himself so as to realize the preordained developments of history. Nothing could be less true. Against this Hegel, against the Hegel of absolute idealism, of absolute knowing, of a kind of predetermined mysticism, one should always insist that the speculative dimension in Hegel is the first step in what Marx would then see in Hegel, which is this notion that the truth lies within the structure itself, not in the content either of the objects in themselves, which is what Kant was of course obsessed with, nor within the sublime metaphysical object of the pure form. The truth lies within their very impossibility, their dialectical mediation, to which the subject is integral. And so the subject-object relationship, which is the classic metaphysical binary going all the way back to Plato, isn't simply upended in Hegel, but in a sense is aufgehoben, to go back to the Hegelian dialectic. It is retained, but also negated. It is retained and saved. It is, if you will, lifted up to another historical category. And I know that we're doing a lot here, and I may not have explained this perfectly, but what's so interesting about Der Besuch der alten Dame, Dürrenmatt's play, The Visit, is that in play form, it essentially has all these arguments about how the structural conditions of the town are overdetermined by its own financial speculative investment in what the woman is offered, how the very ethical system of the town retroactively legitimizes the preconditions for its own unethical act. How the ideology of the town is that the man died of joy, but he died of joy because he knew that his death was going to revitalize the town. In other words, the cause becomes its own effect. That in this internalization, we see therefore not just an allegory of the corrupting nature of money, but precisely the structural mechanism by which the very nature of the subject's identity, and therefore the societal identity with itself through ethics and morality, serves the reproduction of financial interests so as to reproduce itself. And that therefore the speculative identity of the subject in capitalism isn't simply about having more money or being less exploited, working its way up the ladder. It's like Marx said, that essentially the only way to liberate the subject is to liberate it not from capitalism, but for capitalism itself to change and therefore to create a new form of subjectivity. It's why every coping mechanism that is given to you to live a less alienated life nevertheless sustains the very incentive structures of further economic participation and mobility. That therefore the subject is overdetermined by the structural relations by which the subject reproduces itself apropos others to reproduce the economic structure that therefore creates the framework and the coordinates, the horizon, if you will, by which the subject can enter this stage. And that therefore, once one realizes this, the famous idea of class consciousness in Marx, once the subject realizes how its own horizon of possibility is already overdetermined by the reproduction of the economic system, the subject has already changed, and therefore the system has already changed. And so Marx's insight about revolution in history is never simply the sort of pseudo Disney or DreamWorks idea. Remember the movie Ants, where you realize there are more of us than there are of them. It's never that the 99% realizes that it has a numeric superiority to the 1%. It's precisely that this insistence on I too could be the 1% is how the system regenerates itself. It's also why in America we say that most people don't consider themselves poor. They think that they're simply on the path to becoming rich. That the very process by which you experience your exploitation as the conditions for your own salvation are thereby how the economic system regenerates itself. And the speculative value increases and becomes eternal by means of creating a subject in its own name, in its own face, in its own shape. And that therefore the subject becomes the empty commodity of the reproduction of capitalism. And that is the speculative component of Marx's theory of history, which is to say that the subject becomes the empty commodity that reproduces the structural relations of capitalism. And so there's no truth in the commodity. There's no truth in the subject. The only truth lies within the structural relations of the manner in which value is negated and mediated through the supposed fixity of the object. And that is Marx's argument about how in capitalism, everything that is solid melts into air. It's not a transcendental theory by which things that are solid melt into a kind of transcendental horizon. It's that the transcendental emptiness, the dimension of the transcendental, is transferred back into the subject in the form of its own alienation. That the subject's liberation becomes the exact manner in which he remains repressed, to put it in psychoanalytic terms. That the reproduction of the subject is the reproduction of the financial system in its truest form. Therefore, the central thesis of Hegelian speculative idealism, namely that there is no truth either outside the cave nor in the cave, but only in the structural relations of the immanent negation or mediation between these two, finds its realization, finds its truth in the Marxist theory of the commodity. In other words, you could say that the Marxist theory of the commodity, or dialectical materialism, is the Hegelian cunning of reason. It is the Hegelian concept realizing its very notion above and beyond the supposedly absolute idealist notion within Hegel. Hence why, if you want to understand Marx, you have to understand Hegel, but perhaps more importantly, if you want to understand Hegel, you have to understand Marx. At least that is my position. Thank you so much for watching today. I know this has been a lot. I apologize for the jargon that is used here. I really have tried to make this clear. If you'd like to watch the other lectures, you can find them all for free on my Instagram and on my YouTube. I promise that they all connect. The point of this series is not to give you a bullet point summary of these ideas, but to activate them in your own mind, to have a dialectical approach to knowledge and teaching. That has been my goal. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you will be here next week. Until then, if you'd like to read the complete guide to Zizek, you can download it now on my Patreon, which helps me keep these lectures free and open access. You can find all that and more on www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. Thank you, and I will see you next week.